So let me kind of set the stage for positioning your value over price. You know, one of the biggest challenges we're going to face moving into the new year, or really at any time if you think about it, right, is how do you position value when people are focused on price, right? And customers today, because budgets are tightening, right? Budgets are getting squeezed from every which way. You're going to get customers who are going to come back to you and say, hey, can you give me a discount? Can you lower your price? That's too expensive. Is there anything else we can do? And the question then becomes, what do you do? Now, when a customer asks you for a discount, right, that's usually an indication that you didn't position the value over the price. Think about that for a second. Because if you did position the value, they wouldn't be asking for a discount. And usually by the time they ask for that, if I ask you for a discount, can you do better on the price? Yeah, no, I think that's more than I expected to pay. I think we'll think about it, push it in the next quarter. It's too late. It's too late to say, hey, but no, there's real value here. So if you think of a presentation you're doing to a client, over the phone, virtual, whatever, live, one-to-one, think of the starting point of the presentation here. As you go through the presentation, if you try to convince them towards the end of the presentation that there is value, it's too late. Our job is to build value throughout the presentation. I'm going to show you a method I use. This is my formula, my method that I use, and I literally use it all the time. This is like the one go-to positioning value over formula I use. I call it the Dear Me formula, and I'll introduce you to what that is. And what I want you to do is basically see how I do it, see how I close more deals by positioning value over price. And then maybe you can kind of get some ideas, and I'll give you, different examples, different looks at how you can do it. Now, all that said, the objective here is how do we sell our product without having to discount it? How do we position the value over the price? Let's begin with a simple exercise. Let's get into this. So the simple exercise is this. I want you to, again, get out a pen, paper. If you can write this down, that'd be great. If you know where we can write, maybe take out your phone, your Droid, and maybe just type in your notepad and so you can follow along. Now, if you've done this exercise, just kind of take a mental break. But if you've never done this exercise, I want you to zoom in. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I just want you to answer them. Here's the first question I want you to do, is I want you to think of a number. I want you to pick a number. Let me put my head down here somewhere. I want you to pick a number between, let's say, 2 and 10. Okay? Just pick a number between 2 and the number 10. Okay? Now I'm going to do this on my side so I don't get lost either. So pick a number between 2 and 10. If you got that, great. Now take that number and multiply it by 9. So I'm going to do it with you. Multiply it by 9. Got it? All right. Now if you multiply it by 9, you should have a 2-digit number. What I want you to do is add those 2 digits together, and you should have a single-digit number. Right? Great. Now, from that single-digit number that you have, what I'd like you to do is subtract the number 5. So you should have a new single-digit number, right? Now, that number represents, the one you've come up with, that single-digit number represents a letter in the alphabet. So, for example, if you have 1, let me put this here. Let me go back. Sorry. So, in other words, that number should equate to a letter. So if you have the number 1, write the letter A. 2, write the letter B. 3, C, 4, D, 5, E. You get the idea. Write the letter down. Got it? Perfect. Now, next what I want you to do is I want you to think of a European country that begins with that letter. Think of a European country that begins with that letter. You got it? All right. Next, what I want you to do is look at the second letter in that country. Look at the second letter in that country and then think of a large mammal. Just think of a large mammal that begins with that letter. All right? The last part here is I want you to write down the color of that mammal. So write down the color of the mammal. So again, pick a number between 2 and 10. Multiply it by 9, right? Add the 2 digits, right? Once you multiply by 9, add the 2 digits together, subtract 5. You come up with a letter that equates to a country, right? A European country. Think of the country, look at the second letter, and then think of a large mammal. Now, tell me if this makes any sense. There are no gray elephants in Denmark. Hit me with a 1 if you got that. Okay? Gray elephants in Denmark. So let me see how many got it. Say it. A couple of people got it. There's a couple of dabs. There you go. So if you got it, you got it, right? Now, here's what happened. I asked you a sequence of questions that had you arrive at a conclusion that I've already predetermined. In other words, I programmed all these questions to have you arrive at that conclusion, that it's a gray elephant. Now, it's a powerful concept because if you think about it, if I can ask the right questions, I can guide the conversation. This is what the best salespeople do, right? Ask good questions, develop good questions, guide them to where you want them to land. In this case, in your case, this would probably be a product or a service that you offer. And by asking the right questions, you're guiding them to product or service, or more importantly, the ideal features and services that you want to offer or sell them. Now, let's push further. My point here is that by asking the right questions, I can guide people to the conclusion I want them to arrive at, which is the gray elephant. Now, so step one, guide them to your outcome. So if I know what I want to sell, remember, this is the beginning of the presentation. Let me give you a visual. If I'm starting my presentation here with the client, I'm already thinking where I want to land, which is right here, what I want the customer to think. My job then is to figure out what questions do I ask along the way to guide them to that conclusion. That's what we're talking about. I'm going to tie this all together, by the way, so just bear with me. I'm going to tie it all together. Number two. Now, I want to highlight this. When we're selling, so step number one again, ask great questions. Number two, let me kind of set this up before I give you the answer. Remember back in the day, and I use this example a lot because it's very powerful. Back in the day, we used to have record players. We were happy with our record players, right? And there was a gentleman by the name of Ernest Dichter. Most people don't know who Ernest Dichter is. Ernest Dichter is considered the father of motivation research. Not motivation like, woohoo, you're the best. Motivation in terms of how to get people to buy, right? How to really convince people to buy your product. And Ernest Dichter says something interesting. He said, we must make people, listen carefully to the phrase, constructively discontent in order for them to buy. Think about this concept. We must make them constructively discontent in order for them to buy. In other words, if they're happy with what they have, they're not going to buy. But if we can make them constructively discontent, i.e., unhappy, constructively unhappy, then all of a sudden they go, you know what, I think I want to buy your product because I'm not really happy. But sometimes customers don't know that they're not happy. Here's what I mean. Let's go back to the record player. Back in the day, we had record players. Everybody was happy with the record player. Then all of a sudden, remember this? The cassette comes out, the 8-track. If you're old enough, you remember the 8-track. Now, what happened here is interesting. Here you had the record player. When the 8-track came out, for the first time, music became portable. You could put it in, in your radio, your boombox, and take it with you. So all of a sudden, people moved over to the 8-track and they became constructively discontent with the record player. In other words, they became unhappy with the record player. They said, you know what? Let's all buy 8-track cassettes. And everybody was happy again. So everybody's happy. Then this comes out. Remember? The cassette. Now, it's smaller. It's got more songs on them. Instead of 8, it's had 12 songs. And on top of that, another feature was that you can fast forward to the song you wanted. You can't do that. You couldn't do that with an 8-track. So all of a sudden, people became constructively discontent with the 8-track, and they moved over to the cassette. And everybody was happy with the cassette. Then what came out? The CD comes out, right? Now, something interesting happened here. When the CD came out, you would think people would naturally migrate. Analog, digital, you think it would be an easy migration, but it wasn't. Because people were going square versus round. Square versus round, I mean, what's the difference? I mean, this is good enough. So people stayed with the cassette. But that's when the marketing geniuses went to work on our brains. The marketing geniuses said, okay, how do we make people constructively discontent? How do we make them unhappy with the cassette so they'll move over and buy the CD? This is what they did in a nutshell. First of all, they knew that they couldn't explain digital technology in technical terms. It's not going to work, right? Nobody wants to hear about sampling functions, Nyquist functions, DB roll-offs. Confuses people, right? So they had to find simple messaging. And when they said, okay, well, let's kind of give it a name. What does digital mean? It's high fidelity. Oh, great name, marketing. You know, marketing always comes up with branded names, right? So they come up with high fidelity. But then they get, oh, but how do we explain it to the customers? How do we explain it to people so they understand what high fidelity means and why it's better than analog tapes? What happened is they thought about it and they came up with this concept, right? Why don't we tell people the difference between analog and digital and highlight the hiss, that noise, right? So you would hear a commercial that says, what's the difference between analog and digital technology? With digital technology, it's pure digital. You will not hear the sound like you hear on your cassette. Now, a lot of people at the time says, well, wait a minute, I never heard a hiss in my tape. But when somebody, the marketing people, started pointing it out, there's a hiss here. So people went back, listened to the cassette, and what did they start hearing? And as soon as they heard that hiss, and they didn't hear it in digital technology, all of a sudden, they became constructively discontent with the cassette, and they all moved over to the CD, right? Because they became unhappy. Once they heard the hiss, they could not unhear the hiss, right? Once you see the problem, you can't unsee the problem. So then people moved over to the CD, and they were happy with the CD. Then what came out? Remember this? The iPod. Now, how does Steve Jobs make us unhappy with our CDs? Well, instead of having 1,000 CDs, you can buy an iPod and have 1,000 CDs in your pocket. People are like, wow. All of a sudden, people became constructively discontent with the CD, and they moved over to the iPod. Now, the iPod was popular, and where did we go next? To the phone. Now, what did they sell us? How did they sell us? How did they move us? How did they make us unhappy with the iPod? They said, why carry two devices when one will do? So all of a sudden, you're like, whoa, you're right. So then we became unhappy with our iPods, and we moved over to the phone. Now today, they don't even want us to keep the music on the phone. They want us to keep it where? In the cloud, right? So they make us unhappy with keeping music here. You say, no, you need to have it in the cloud, right? But notice the events here. That if somebody's unhappy, then they'll make a move. If I'm unhappy, I'll make a move. If I'm unhappy, I'll make a move. But if I'm happy, I'm content, I'm not going to make the move, right? So what Ernest Dichter, father of motivation research, is saying, if people are happy, they're not going to move. So we must make them constructively discontent, so then they will buy from us. That's why a lot of clients typically say, you know, now's not a good time. Love your product, love your service. I'm sure it can help us, but you know, what we got is good enough. Not right now. That means we didn't sell the value, because that's what value is. Once you sell value, value is making people unhappy with what they have that they want to buy your product. Let's go further. Here's an example, and I've used this example in the past, but it's a powerful example of this concept of making people constructively discontent. And now I'm going to tie constructively discontent with asking questions. Now, so I have a UPS mailbox. This happened a few years ago, right? I have a UPS mailbox, and every year I pay $220, right? For that mailbox right there, right? That mailbox right there, right? And I remember Sally, the lady behind the counter, told me, hey, by the way, Victor, your contract's almost up. It's time to renew your contract. To which I said, well, I don't get a lot of mail. I said, let me ask you a question, Sally. I said, how much is a smaller mailbox? And she said, well, Victor, that's $160. I'm paying $220, that's $160. Now, what is my brain thinking? What is my brain thinking at this point? My brain's thinking $60 is $60, right? To me, if I could save $60, that's like 12 lattes at Starbucks, right? That's my economy. And so I'm thinking, I want to save $60. That's my brain. You ever have customers do that? They're buying something, or you show them option A, but then they always look at the cheaper option, right? And they're leaning towards the cheaper option because all they want to do is save money. All they want to do is save money, right? And you try to give this, no, you want to go with the big one. You want to go with the big one. And Sally says to me, because she sees me leaning towards the cheap one, she says, Victor, let me ask you a question. Now, I know what she's going to say. She's going to say something like this. Victor, you want to stay with the big box because it's easy access. You also want to stay with the big box because bigger is better. And this means Guess what? It's going to be more convenient for you. You don't have to pick up your mail as often because you have a bigger mailbox, Victor. On top of that, your mailbox won't get jammed with a lot of letters and packages. And guess what? Your letters won't get crushed. And you want to stay with the big one because it can handle bigger packages, right? This is selling the feature, the gain, right? This is what we do. No, you want to buy this one because A, B, C, D, E. But that's not what Sally did. That's what I thought she would do. That's not what she did. Here's what she did. She did this. Victor, let me ask you a question. To which I said, what? And she says, I understand, she says, that you want to save $60. She's being very empathetic. But she sold the pain and the loss. Here's what she says. I understand you want to save $60. But, remember, when you use the word but, it negates everything before it. She says, if you change your mailbox, you'll have to change your address. To which I'm like, so what? That's not a big deal. I can do that. Number two, she said, on top of that, if you have a business card printed up, you'll have to change that information, so you'll have to reprint all your business cards. On top of that, Victor, if you change mailboxes, you also have to go to your website. I don't know if you edit your own websites, but you'll have to change all the information on your websites or anything online. The next one here is you'll also have to change all the information on all your promotional material. I have a lot of promotional material. And then, last but not least, she said this. You'll have to contact your clients to let them know that you've changed your address. Victor, one more question. How much time and money is that going to cost you? The thing is, I wasn't thinking that. Much like the hiss, I didn't really hear it. I didn't really think about the real cost of making the change because I was so focused on saving $60 that I didn't really think about the cost of what it was going to cost me if I did change. I was focused on saving $60. And through a series of questions, what she did was she shifted my focus from $60 to pain, what it's going to cost you if you make that change. And the conclusion was obvious. I just said, renew the contract. I don't want to change anything because it wasn't worth it for me. But again, notice what Sally did. She didn't try to keep selling me the feature, the benefit, the advantage, the gain. She said, no, I'm not going to sell you the gain piece here. I'm going to show him what he's going to miss out on, the loss. And this right here is highlighting the hiss, right? The problem you're solving. And so two things are happening here. One is that Sally knew how to shift my focus from saving $60 to the hiss. Number two is that she knew how to ask the right questions. No great elephants in Denmark. She knew that if she asked these sequence of questions, she would shift my thinking or control my thinking. And that's powerful. If you understand that concept, that's powerful. If you know what the end point is, just shift the end point. If I want them to arrive here, A to B, I want them to arrive here. What questions do I need to ask to get them there? So again, number two, we have to shift thinking. And the best way to shift thinking is through a series of questions. Now, let me see if I can give you an example here. And I want to highlight this for you. If you're going to write anything down, this is what you should write. The average salesperson practices what to say. The best of the best of the best practice what to ask. Now, it's a powerful concept because most people think that they have to prepare, they got to say it the right way. They focus on what they have to say. Again, think of yourself in a presentation. Again, virtual or live, doesn't matter. You're doing 30, 45 minutes, beginning to end, start, finish. My question to you is, what questions are you asking throughout that presentation to guide the customer to a conclusion, gray elephants in Denmark, that you want them to arrive at? That is when you go next level in terms of selling value. Because again, you're controlling the conversation and you're having them arrive at the value that you offer. Let me give you a tangible example. It's a simple example, but you'll get the idea, right? First thing you have to do, let's say for you, here's an exercise I want you to think about. Then I'm going to give you an example. If you're doing a presentation, the question you should ask yourself is, what are the three key things? What are the three key messages that I want the customer to take away when we're finished with the presentation? When I put the proposal, what are the three things I want them to focus on when I finish that proposal? What are the three things that we know as a product or a service we're the best at, we're good at, And I want the customer to think about those three things. This is the end point, right? This is where you want to land. That's the outcome, the great elephants in Denmark. Next, what I want you to do is develop then a series of questions. Again, if I know I'm starting the presentation here, I know I've drawn this already, here's where I'm starting, and I know that I want to land right here at the three key messages, what questions do I ask, and I'm going to give you an example how to do this, to land here so the customer goes, I get it. Much like Sally did with the UPS store, with the UPS mailbox, how do I have you land? The last part here is, if you do this, as you're going and asking these questions, what are you doing? You're shifting their thinking, okay? That's the basic premise of this master class. If I know where I want to land, if I know how to develop the right questions, then I will shift their thinking from price to value. Did you get that? These are the three big takeaways for today. What's the end point in the presentation? If you're doing software demos, what are the three key messages that I want them to take away at the end? Where do I want to land? So then I work backwards. I then construct questions, gray elephants in Denmark, and then I shift their thinking. And again, shift the thinking from price to value. That's what we're trying to do here. Let me give you a very simple example, but it'll highlight how you might want to use this. Let's say that this is the two starting points here. Again, simple example, but it's something that we can all understand. Let's say that I sell laptops, right? I sell laptops. Now, here's my end point down here. So what do I want to land? What do I want you to walk away thinking? Well, let's go through it. I want you to focus in on the processing power. I also want you to focus in on the screen size, and maybe I want you to focus in on battery life. There should be a Y there. Battery life, right? That's what I want you to focus in on. So if my starting point is I want to sell you a laptop, let's say, for example, over a desktop, or maybe I don't want to focus on hard drive space, right? Or RAM. I want you to focus on these three things because we know as a company, we're the best when it comes to processing power, screen size, capability, and battery life. Let's say that those are the three key things I want to land on. Then we work backwards. Let's go full screen. We then try to come up with the right questions, right? So for example, let's go with processing power. I would say, what questions would I ask somebody so they can focus on processing power? Maybe the first thing I can do is, what type of work do you do? And let's say I'm talking to somebody who does, I don't know, film production or, video production work, right? So they're going to tell me this is the type of work we do, Victor. Film production, I'll ask other questions like, what's your workflow like? In other words, you film something, record something, what's your workflow like, right? Now, all this ties into processing power. And then I could say, is rendering important? For those of you who know anything about video editing, rendering is how much time does it take? I finish editing, hit the render button to export the actual movie or MP4, right? So rendering time is a big deal. And I know that in many cases, if I'm selling somebody who's in the film or video industry, that rendering time, specifically rendering time, is important. And that ties into processing power. So then I make them basically say, Victor, you're right. Processing power is important to me. That's the confirmation through the presentation. So again, if you're doing a presentation from here to here, let's just do it this way. Here's the start of the presentation. Here's the end of your presentation. Then what I want to do is begin to ask questions right here. And then again, these questions are all about what? Processing power. And I can figure out what type of questions I want to ask. Now let's move to the next one. I do the presentation. I really emphasize how important it is to have high processing power, right? But I also want to shift them over to screen size. What type of questions do I ask from screen size? Well, let me clear this a little bit. Screen size, I can ask these types of questions. For example, do you do a lot of editing? Do you do it yourself or does somebody else do it for you? Number two, again, how many hours do you spend in front of a screen, right? Number three could be, for example, how many apps do you have running at the same time? Now, the reason I'm asking these questions is because if I'm spending a lot of time editing, I probably want a bigger screen, right? If I'm spending a lot of hours, I definitely want a bigger screen and I want to be able to control, how bright or dim it may be. Again, I'm being very simple here, but I also will want to ask, how many apps, how many applications are you running when you're editing? He says, well, I'm pretty much editing like using two or three different apps, which means I want to be able to see 2 or 3 different apps or 3 different windows within my screen, which means you're going to need a bigger screen size. So, Mr. Customer, the fact that you're doing a lot of editing, spending a lot of hours, right? You're doing the editing, you're spending a lot of hours, and you're running at least 3 apps. That means one of the requirements for you has to be a big screen. They probably go, yeah, you're right. It has to be a big screen. Let's go to battery life. So battery life, I could ask questions like this. Are you traveling a lot? Are you on the road a lot? They'll probably go, yeah, I'm doing a lot of stuff on the road. Next, are you doing a lot of in-field recording? In other words, you have to do a lot of in-field recording and maybe a lot of in-the-field editing, out, in other words, out of the studio, out in the field. They're probably going to go, yeah. Last one could be something as simple as, is weight, an issue? Because you're carrying a lot of equipment, is weight, do you want to have a machine that's very light? And they go, yes. So you can highlight here that 1, your battery is not as heavy as other competitors. That's where you want to land, right? You also want to emphasize that you have a longer battery life. So it's lighter, and at the same time, it's not heavy. And if you do a lot of in-the-field work, this is the type of battery you want. Now again, it's a simple example, but you see where I'm going with this, that I'm trying to drive them. Here's what I'm trying to sell them. I know that I want to land here. Then I'm asking questions to drive the conversation this way, so I land right there. That's what I do, right? And that's what I want you to start thinking about. Take away from this is that if I can set this up, now when I put together a proposal, I know that these are the 3 big things I have them focused on. The way I like to look at it is, there's a lot of things a customer can look at, right? Your job is to control, almost like put blind to say, look, I need you to focus on this right here. What Sally did to me in the UPS store said, I was focused on price. She says, no, you should look at cost. By asking me questions, she shifted my thinking. By asking the right questions, knowing that you want them to focus on these 3 things, then you ask questions that will drive this perspective, okay? Now, what I want to do now is I want to give you an example of what I do and how I close deals, right? Because all this is hypothetical, right? But let me give you something tangible now. This is what I do when I want to close deals. One of the pushbacks I get is, Victor, your training is too expensive, right? I get people who will call in, get on a conference call with me. I do sales training, and they say, Victor, your price, your budget, whatever it may be, is too expensive. We can't afford you. To which I was like, remember, in order to control a conversation, you have to ask questions. And what I do is I ask a series of questions, but also know this. I ask questions knowing where I want to take them. And this is why if I were to calculate my close rate, it's probably like 90%, if not better. And here's what's even more important. If you ask me what's my discount rate, how often do I discount? Less than 10% of the time. In other words, 1 out of 10 deals maybe I'll discount, right? Because when I get to the end, they see the value. So I want to show you what I do, and then maybe you can take what I do and fit it into your model, okay? And I'm also going to give you a structure for the model so you can come up with your own way of doing it. So let's do this. Step number 1 in my method is get the data. So again, right, get the data. By the way, I will make this available, this presentation available in PDF form in the Sales Velocity Academy, okay? So you guys will have access to that as well. Now, get the data. What does that mean? Let me just start out. Remember, I typically charge, let me give you an example. Let's put numbers on this thing. So let's say for a keynote, as of today, I charge $20,000 for a keynote, right? 1 hour. And sometimes I throw in a 1 or 2 hour workshop and keep it at the same price. So it's $20,000 for a keynote and or a small workshop, right? Customer goes, whoa, that's more than I expect to pay. That's too expensive. To which I'm thinking, no, it isn't. But I know that I got to ask the right questions. Now, here's the data I want to collect. I want to collect data first so then I can make my argument. So let's say you call me in. We talk, I tell you 20,000. You say, whoa, Victor, that's too expensive, right? Here are the questions I would ask. But let me set this up first. For those of you who are familiar with the Sales Velocity Academy, you should be familiar with the Sales Velocity equation. It works like this. Let me just do a quick review. If you take the number of opportunities in your pipeline, you multiply by your close rate, right? On average, how many deals are you closing? For every 10, how many do you close? You multiply by the average deal size, and then you divide it by how long it takes you to close a deal, you come up with the sales velocity. For example, if I have 10 opportunities in the pipeline, 10 potential clients, right? My close rate is 40%. That's 0.4, right? My average deal size, I'll say, is $1,000, right? I'm making this up. And my sales cycle is I typically close these one per month, right? It takes a month to close these, right? If you multiply that number, this is 0.4 times this is 4, 4 times that is 4,000. My sales velocity is I'm selling $4,000 per month, right? That's how you calculate a sales velocity. That's how much you're selling, how fast you're selling. I got 10 opportunities every month. I'm closing, again, 0.4, and then on average, which means I close 4 deals times 1,000, that's $4,000 per month. That's what I'm generating. Now, if you're selling high enterprise systems, make that 100,000, okay? Whatever it may be. 10 opportunities, $100,000, add 2 more zeros. You're making, again, $400,000, whatever it may be. That's how you calculate sales velocity. Now, when I'm talking to a client, they say, Victor, you're too expensive. The data I'm looking for are these 4 pieces of data. Because if I know these 4 pieces of data, I know where I want to guide the conversation. Let me walk through it, okay? I'm gonna walk you through it step by step. But now that you understand that, keep in mind, I want to collect these data points from my customers. Customer calls in, it's Jay. Jay said, Victor, I need you to come in, do some sales training. I said, well, Jay, and I said, $20,000. Jay says, Victor, that's too expensive. I said, well, Jay, let me ask you a couple of questions. He says, yes. I said, in a given month, can you tell about the number of opportunities? Let's go through it. Again, let me back up. So number of opportunities, close rate, average deal size, sales cycle, right? This is where they're at today. This is where Jay's at. Jay tells me, well, Victor, on average, we have this many opportunities. We have a 40% close rate. Victor, average deal size is about $1,000, and we close one every month, right? Keep it there. Then I asked Jay the follow-up question. I said, Jay, what are your expectations? What do you think you should be at? And he said, well, Victor, my expectations are this. If I were to highlight one thing we need to do better, high leverage activity. One thing we need to do better, Victor, this is where we're falling behind. Jay says to me, Victor, it's our close rate. We're at 40%. Jay, where do you think you should be? Jay says, Victor, we should be at 50%. Now, at this point, I basically have 5 data points. The 4 from the Sales Velocity Academy, number of opportunities, close rate, average deal size, sales cycle. Now, Jay's giving me the 5th variable, which is where he wants to be. Instead of 40% close rate, Jay wants to be at 50%, right? Now, this is all the data I need to begin the argument of why and position my value, of why they should buy from me and how I can position my value. Let's push further. Now, step 3, let's go through it again. I collect the data, right? The 4 bullet points, right? The 4 variables. Then I ask Jay, step number 2, what are your expectations? For example, he says, Victor, this is the one activity I want to focus in on. We need to be better at closing deals, right? So what do you think your close rate should be? Victor, should be 50%. Now, if he says, well, our average deal size is 1,000, I said, well, what do you think it should be? I think it should be 2,000. Great. That's the data point I would collect. But in this case, Jay told me it's the close rate. So now I got to start doing the analysis. Where I am at 40% and where I want to be, right? Now, again, Jay's focused on paying me $20,000. I'm trying to shift his thinking to focus in on what he's losing. Here's how you do it. Let's get into detail now. This is where it starts getting really good, okay? So, the close rate is 4 out of 10. That's where they're currently at. Next, if you think about it, they want to be at 5 out of 10 deals. That's a 50% close rate, right? They want to be at 50%. Next, I know that their sales cycle is a month. In other words, they close these deals once a month, right? It takes a month to close these deals. Now, notice what I'm going to start doing here. In other words, if they're at 4, they should be at 5. That means they're losing what? 1 out of 10 deals. That's their loss. That's a simple calculation, right? In other words, instead of closing 4, we need to be closing 5. So that means you're losing. You believe that the customer is losing 1 deal a month. Now, if you're losing 1 deal a month, and in this case, I'll say that the average deal size is $10,000. That means they're losing one deal every month. They should be winning. Let me slow down because I want you to get this. I want to go slow. The close rate is currently at 4 out of 10 deals. The customer, Jay in this case, says, no, we should be at 5 out of 10 deals. That's where we need to be. That's where we need to start closing more deals, which means they're losing one deal per month. And if the average deal per month is $10,000, that's the potential loss. That's what they're losing every month. Jay, the manager, believes they're losing one extra deal every month. So again, that's $10,000 a month. Then you push further. If you're losing one deal per month, that means, run the numbers, but on average, that means you're losing $120,000. Right? Now again, you may think it's obvious, but think about, again, the UPS mailbox. I'm trying to save $60,000. Jay is trying to save $20,000. I'm like, dude, you're not looking at it. I ask a bunch of questions and I shift his thinking towards, oh, it's costing me $120,000 because I'm not winning these deals, right? So all of a sudden I'm beginning to shift, but I don't stop there. I like to dig deeper. For me, if there's pain, I try to really rip it open and show them what they're really missing out on. Then I ask Jay this question. Again, I start collecting more data. Say, Jay, how do you calculate your customer lifetime value, right? And again, the manager, Jay, could say, what do you mean customer lifetime value? For example, if, I buy from you, right? I buy from you, over the next 3 years, let's say, given time period of 3 years, how much more do customers buy? How much more will they buy? So in other words, if I sell you the first time, you buy $10,000. Over the next 3 years, on average, what do you think your customers will buy? Because we always buy a little more, right? From whoever we're buying from. And Jay says, well, I said, what do you mean, Victor? I said, what's the 3-year time frame? And then all of a sudden, we say, well, we've calculated this. I'm making this number up. Jay says it's about 30% of the average deal size. So in other words, if I sell somebody a $10,000 item, Victor, over the next 3 years, they'll buy 30% of that value. In other words, they'll buy another $3,000. So I got $3,000 by taking 30%, multiplying it by $10,000. So on average, this equals $3,000 over the next year, over the next 3 years, or $1,000 per year, right? So that's the customer lifetime value. Then I push further. I say, well, if you lose one deal per month, if you're losing one deal per month, that means that there's the 3,000, right? If you're losing one client per month, that client, you're not getting that value anymore. In other words, because I didn't close that one deal, I don't get the customer lifetime value of $3,000. And then I run these numbers. Annual customer lifetime value loss is 12. If I'm losing one extra customer a month, I'm not getting that $3,000. So that's also costing you $36,000. Manager Jay says, wow, I didn't think about that. Because it's not about just the initial buy, $10,000. It's also what would have they bought? What would they, what they would buy over the next 3 years. And again, you calculate that number out. In this case, it's $36,000. But I don't stop there. I keep asking questions because I'm trying to shift them off to $20,000. Then I move to one more. This is another analysis I do. I said, on average, your customers, how many referrals do they give you? If you get a new customer, how many referrals do they give you? You say, we might get one referral from one customer every year. One referral from one customer, right? But if they're losing a customer, that means the average deal size, because again, if I'm losing the customer, I'm not getting that extra referral. And if I get a referral and I close the deal, that's $10,000. That means that if I add $3,000, which is the customer lifetime value, and then now this is what it's costing me. So let me be clear here. If I get a referral from a customer that I closed, right? If I get a referral, that means hypothetically I could close that customer because it's a referral, right? Close rate goes up. Because I closed that deal at $10,000, they also have a customer lifetime value, 30% of 3 years. So that's $13,000. So every referral could be worth that much. So then step number 4 is where I bring it all together. Here's where I calculate the results. And here's what I would show Jay. So Jay, based on our conversation, let's walk through what's happening in your business. I said, Jay, your annual client loss one per month, you're losing one deal per month, is costing you 120. On top of that, the customer value, lifetime value of what they would buy if they were your customers is $36,000, as I showed you already. And your referral loss is $13,000. Jay, basically you're losing $169,000 a year because your close rate is at 40 and not at 50%. You're not winning that extra deal. I said, but then I asked Jay this one other question. So Jay, I got a question for you. How many salespeople do you have? Jay says, I got 10 salespeople. Well, if I multiply that by 10, then your overall loss is really like $1.6 million, $1.7 million. You get the idea. In other words, Jay, I'm not that expensive. Here's what you're losing out on, and I'm only costing you $20K. I'm not that expensive. Now look at what I did here. I basically, again, asked a sequence of questions to have them arrive at the conclusion that I'm not expensive. Jay's thinking I'm expensive. By a series of questions, asking him the data, I shift his mind over. And this is positioning value over price. Let me give you a visual of what this looks like, because sometimes we need to get a visual, right? So here's what it looks like. Here's my model. Let me see if I can put my head up here. There you go. So the first thing I want you to look at is the data piece right here, right? So if you look at the data right here, the data that I collected went something like this. By the way, this whole thing right here is just a path, right? This is a path to get to an endpoint right here. So here's what I did. What's your average deal size? What's your sales cycle? These are the questions I'm asking because I want to pull the data out, right? And then I asked Jay, what are your expectations? Where do you think you need to be? What should your close rate be? So forth and so on. How about your deals/sales cycle? Whatever questions I need to ask. Then, as you saw me do the analysis, what's the gap of where you're at and where you should be? Jay said it was 40, I need to be at 50. Okay, average deal size per sales cycle, you get the idea. I calculate the customer lifetime value, and I also calculate the cost of referrals. And then the last part was total cost, and then I multiply by the number of salespeople, so you can just reach the conclusion you should buy from me. That's what I call the Dear Me model. I collect data. I ask about expectations, where they want to be. I then really analyze the numbers. Now, I know how to do this in my head, but sometimes if I'm live with somebody, I walk them through on paper, right? Well, let's walk through it. Here's where you want to be. Here's where you're at. And you do the gap analysis, and then you calculate the results. And when they see the results, like in this case, 1.7 million more or less, they're like, wow, you're not that expensive. Now, you may be saying, well, Victor, how about if they don't believe it's 1.7? I always say this. Do you believe half of what I said? Half of 1.7, run the numbers, because I can't do it right now. It's like 700 something, right? Almost 700. I said half of that would be like $350,000. As you can still see, I'm not that expensive. And just this thought process of how much they're losing gets them to start thinking. Again, they're thinking, I want to save $60, and then I shift their thinking. They think $20,000 is too much. By a series of questions, you gradually bring them over. You shift their thinking over to this side. Much like the computer example. I know where I want them to focus in on. I know that I want them to focus in on average deal size, close rate, right? Number of opportunities, or shorten the sales cycle. Those are 4 things I want them to focus in on. My job is to ask the questions so they get right here and they go, okay, I see what you mean. That's how you work this model. It's not a hard model to work. So again, data, find out what their expectations are. Here's where you do the gap analysis of where they are, where they want to be, and then you calculate the results. If you do this, it becomes very obvious to the customers that you're not expensive. Because again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I really want you to get this. Customers aren't focused on what they're losing. They're focused on what they want to save. They're not focused on what they're losing. They're focused on what they want to save. And our job is to shift their thinking to what they're losing. By not buying your product or service, here's what you're losing. Because again, people will run from pain. But if you look at gain, again, it's not as effective. So always sell the pain over the gain. You say that again, pain over gain. I can tell you about the gain. Remember the mailbox? But that's not going to impact me. But as soon as I talk about the pain, the loss, what you're losing every month, multiplied by 10 salespeople, this is the real cost of inaction, of not training your people, all of a sudden you have a totally different conversation. So that's the model. That's the dear me, buy from me model that you could use. And again, at the end, the conclusion is I'm not that expensive. So I'm going to pause right here, let you guys ask me questions, and let's see where we go from here. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me get some feedback. Again, hit me in the Q&A. I can look at this now and answer some questions. 90% close rate, Jay says it's too high. Jay said, and that's how Victor has made me happily pay him $20,000, okay? Jay says, how to increase the value of your work? Upfront purchase, customer lifetime value, referral value. Any questions aside from Jay? Jay's got some great statements, questions. Any questions on what we just talked about? Was it clear? Victor, what can we do about habitual discount askers? I really hate them. Some say it is part of the Chinese culture to always ask for a discount, but I refuse to accept it. By the way, there are cultures where they just want to negotiate, right? And so again, in the Sales Velocity Academy, I think I have a course. I forget the name of the course is, I call it 8 discount countermeasures, 8 ways to stop from discounting. So for example, if somebody says, give me a discount, let's say you present a proposal, Jay. You have a proposal and you have all these wonderful line items. And I know you probably know this already. When someone says, Victor, can I get a discount? I said, I can't do that, but why don't you go ahead and cross out what you don't want and I'll recalculate the price, right? That's one way of handling that. If somebody wants a discount, I can also use that in exchange for. In other words, well, Jay, if you extend the contract from 1 year to 3 years, then I'll be more than happy to do a 10% discount. Or, Jay, if you increase the volume of your buy, I'll be more than happy to do that. Another strategy is, let's do this. If let's say it's in January, we're in January, you want a discount, so I'll tell you what, when your buy level hits a certain level, like let's say you hit $500,000, I will give you an additional 5 to 10%. And when you hit $1 million in spend, I'll give you another 2 or 3%. So I can do that. In other words, make them earn that discount. So there's several ways you can handle it. But as I always say, be bold, be confident when you're dealing with customers who always ask for a discount. If I discount the price, can I also discount the work? I tried this, but it didn't work out for me. I would never say you would discount the work because that's undervaluing what you're offering. That's almost saying, I'll give you a crappier piece of equipment. You know, you never want to say that. I would never use that clause because you could use it as a ha-ha. If I discount the price, I can discount, the service I give you. It's never a very positive way to respond to that. So I would not use that one at all. Any other questions, statements from anybody? You guys are very quiet, which I appreciate. Anybody? Got Alan, Andrew, Ben, Fernando's here, Keith Peavy, Casero. Again, any questions or just feedback in general? Let me see. Sylvia, any advice on handling competition? What do you mean when they mention competition, when they bring up the competition, right? So let me you can clarify the question. Sylvia, let me see if I can give you some answers because people typically ask me this question on competition. If you visually look at it from this point, let me back up. Sylvia, there's a company by the name of Gong.io, Gong, G-O-N-G, Gong.io, did an interesting study. And it said that if a customer mentions competition early on in a conversation or presentation, that's a good sign because they're mentioning competition because they want to see if you can do better than the competition. It's when they don't mention competition, you should be afraid. So if they mention competition, that's good news. But let's say that the customer brings up competition. Remember, our job is to shift their focus. So for example, if one of the things I did when I sold technology products is that I would do something called a comparative analysis, right? I'll just keep it simple. A comparative analysis is this. Here's the features right here. These are all features I have, right? This is my company. This is competitor A, B, C. Let's get rid of that. What I would then do is say, here's feature set A, B, C, D, F, whatever. I got all these features. I would then fill out this grid. And I say, okay, we offer this, we offer this, we offer this, but we don't offer D or F. I'll just say E. We don't offer these two. Our competitors offer this, 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 this. And then I would look at that and say, okay, so who am I competing against? So if I know who I'm competing against, I know that I offer feature A, my competitors don't offer that. I would lead my customer to that feature. You need that feature because I know they don't offer it, right? Now, I offer this feature, right? I want to lead them there. Now, if they bring up these two, remember, I remind them that they don't offer this feature. So again, the key is to drive them towards your feature set. In other words, your strength. And then you can talk about, let me see, let's say you don't offer these two, right, Sylvia? You don't offer these two features. You don't offer these two. You're like, right here, What you then do is in your presentation, you try to take these two features and you minimize them. These are not really that important. They're important, but they're not critical, right? You try to push them down. So if this was an important stack, like what's important, you're trying to push, get the green going here. You're trying to push these three up into the customer mindset. You're trying to say, these are the most important ones. These two, if you get them, fine. And that's how you separate yourself from your customer. But again, two things are going on here. One is you want to raise the importance of these, minimize these in your presentation. But at the same time, in your presentation, you know that you want to lead them to these three. So what questions would you ask throughout your presentation so they come to the conclusion that these three are the most important things to think about? And there's how you refocus them in your presentation. Let me know if that helped a little bit. Counteract, okay, great, got it. Justin says, do you have any good questions to ask when doing an in-home sales for renovating in a very competitive market? When doing in-home sales for home renovation, so you're going to renovate the home like a kitchen, a bathroom, or something like that? If that's what you're asking, Justin, we just went through that, and I thought that was really interesting. The best questions they asked, again, we knew what we wanted already because we had done the research online, Justin. So let's kind of reset the table here for your question, right? Is that I'm a buyer here, and you're going to come into my house, and you're going to try to sell me on something, 1, 2, 3, on why it's important, right? Now keep in mind, Justin, depending on who you're talking to, the first question I would ask, this is a powerful question, is how much research have you done? Again, I'm assuming is, and you can give me a follow-up. You're very welcome, Sylvia. Give me a follow-up, Justin, on is it a bathroom? Is it kitchen remodel? Is it a whole thing? Whatever it may be. But the first thing, let's say it's a bathroom remodel. The first question I ask is, how much research have you done? Great question. Now, you're going to give one of three answers. I've done some, I've done none, and I've done a ton of research, right? Those three, right? Now, if they've done a ton of research, love them because they mean they know. They know what they want. They also know what the price points are, right? They already know. If they've done some, I would then dig in a little bit. Well, what have you found? That's a great follow-up question. Well, tell me what you found. So, for example, Justin, we want to redo our bathroom. We want to remodel our bathroom. I said, well, tell me how much research have you done on the bathroom? And they'll say, no, we've done a lot of research. I said, what have you found? What do you like? What have you found? What did you like? What are you looking at? In other words, questions along those lines to try to dig into what they found and what they like, dislikes, right? Now, if they haven't done any research, this is a tough one, Justin, because we almost have to start from ground zero. This is when I would start framing pricing early in the conversation. By framing pricing means if they've done no research, that means I'm starting from zero. Which means they're just calling. Hey, Justin, can you come over and look at our place? You come over. How much research have you done? None. I'm like, I want to roll my eyes, right? But if I then say, that's fine. You just take a positive attitude. That's okay. Then I start asking about, what are you thinking of doing? Just give me a high level. What are you thinking of doing with this bathroom? Are we pulling that out, putting this in, taking this out, putting that in? What are you thinking? Are we doing the floors also? Are we doing something else special? Are we moving pipe around? What are we doing? They'll tell you, they'll give you the dream board. I said, well, let me just take this part right here. Let's begin to talk about pricing a little bit, is what I would tell my customer. I said, when we talk about moving a bathroom or putting in a new I said, the price range is going to be somewhere on the low end, probably like $5,000, and maybe on the high end about maybe $10,000 to $15,000. I'll just say $15,000. And we can talk about more details in just a bit. Now, when we're talking about doing this, I said this right here is about a $2,000 to $5,000 upgrade, kind of in that range, here and there. So if you want to do just this, it's about this. This is the range. If you want to do something that's really more complete, then you're looking at kind of like this. Where does this fit in your budget? That would be my next question. Now, I framed them with pricing, and it's tell me where it would fit in your budget. Okay, it's this much, right? I said, well, then we have the option of really working here or working on this. I said, which one would be your priority? Oh, well, this right here, the cabinets over here in the bathroom. See what I'm doing, Justin? I'm just guiding the pricing conversation now. But I first of all, I framed the pricing, A, B, C. Now I got 3 options to work with. And then are we doing the whole thing? What's your budget? Okay, so we need to either do this or this. And then that's when you can start really getting into that. Let me know if that helps you a little bit, but that's how I would start doing it. I would worry first about what they're focused in on. Let's go to the other extreme, by the way, before I leave this topic. If they've done a ton of research, they typically know what they want, and they also understand what the price points are. The biggest concern might be delivery and execution, right? When can you install it? How fast can you install it, especially in this day and age? And I would ask, in this time period we're living in, because of supply chain issues, having the price conversation is great. Talking about scarcity, in other words, finding the materials is one thing, right? So you can say, hey, we need to talk about, getting the right material. Number 2, we need to talk about scheduling because, again, everything's getting pushed out. And then this is where you can kind of create a sense of urgency, when you're talking to the client. And you can say, we do very well with this because we have inventory, whatever it may be. We can probably install this faster than most of our competitors, so forth and so on. But to your point is I would ask great questions at the beginning. Frame pricing, know what they know about pricing. If they know a ton, that's great. They pretty much know already. We just have to position the value of what is it that they want. And then again, within the Sales Velocity Academy, there's courses on positioning value. There's one on inside the buyer's mind. I think you should go after that one. Let me know if that helped a little bit. Will we have access to this recording, says Keith. Great stuff, by the way. Yes, you will. It'll be in the Sales Velocity Academy, and also you'll get a copy of the presentation as well in PDF form that you can download. Andrew. Justin does Windows. One of my favorite groups, by the way. Let me see. Okay, let me hit Andrew real quick here. When initially establishing your questions to drive the conversation of value shifting, what strategies do you use to develop your initial set of questions? Is this based on our product service strengths, or is it weighted more heavily on the client's need? That's a really good question. So what you're hoping is that, the ideal situation, right, Andrew, is that you've identified the ideal client profile and they really match up. Then they're kind of pretty much aligned. But let's say that the client has specific needs. It's a great question. Love the question. Let's say that the client right here has 3 specific needs, right? I'll call it A, B, C, right? Now, these are 3 must-haves, right? You're right here, beginning of the presentation, right? Those are the things they want. Now, 2 things have to happen is that hopefully what we offer aligns with those 2 or 3 needs, right? That's what we're hoping. In the ideal situation, like if we don't offer B, then we got to find a way to minimize B. It's not that important, right? Shift it down. Move these 2 up, shift that one down because we don't offer that one. But let's say you do offer A, B, C. Another part of our question development strategy is there something they're not thinking about that they should be thinking about? In other words, is there a D and is there an E that they're not thinking about? Because that's positioning value. Because the customer goes, I never thought about that. I never really thought about putting that in also. So keep in mind we're doing 2 things here to answer your question in a very short format. Here's what the customer needs. If we can hit all 3, if we can't, then we really have to minimize this one. I'm not saying it's not important, but just say these are the 2 features you want, right? These are 2 must-haves. We don't offer this, and it's okay to admit that we don't offer that, but these are the 2 things you really want. But what you're not thinking about that's more important than this is this right here. This is the hiss. The thing they're not looking at, they're not listening for. Just like when they asked me the question on the UPS store lady, Sally, I wasn't thinking about the cost, but when she started enumerating them, then I focused in on them and I said, oh, you're right. So again, our job is twofold. Try to line it up with their needs, which is why we ask great discovery questions, right? But remember, our job is not just to fulfill their needs. is to really highlight other things that they're not thinking about. That's important to, that distinction is important because this is what we're often trained on, is how do you sell the feature benefit, gains. But here is where you sell what I call the hiss or the insight, the information beyond the obvious. Let me know if that helped a little bit, Andrew. So Justin, on the windows, it would almost be the same thing. How much research have you done? Tell me what you found, double pane versus single pane, this type of seal versus that type of seal. Those are the questions I would ask. And again, I would start framing early because you're going to count the number of windows, right? The types of windows and trying to, give them an estimate. If they've done no research, Justin, I want to emphasize again, the earlier you can frame pricing. I don't say anchor pricing. I don't like anchoring. Anchoring means you give them one price point. I like to frame pricing. So look, Mr. Customer, let's say you're 5-10 minutes into your walkthrough. I said, well, let's answer the big questions first. I said, right now I'm looking at about 10,000 windows, and depending on the types of windows that you want, I said, we're looking at a range of this per window or that per window. So in order for me to give you a more detailed budget, can I ask you a couple of questions? And then this is where I would start driving to whatever feature I want them to buy in a specific window. For example, if it's energy conservation, I want to talk about that, right? If it's whatever, your business better than I do. If there's a certain type of material that's better than this, double pane versus single pane, this material versus that material, I would start driving the conversation by saying, the reason you want to focus on this, Mr. Client, is because. That's another, another class. But one of the things I do often is have these phrases that say, you want to focus on this and you want to pay a little more for this because. Right? And then you provide some type of social proof. So hopefully that helps. I know I'm answering these questions in a short amount of time, but I can sit down with each of these questions for like 2-3 hours. Soli or Soli, one of the two, right? We are in the dental space and your videos apply as well. When we sell value, it's usually towards the benefit of the health patient, but patients do not see the value of health, rather what it costs to get them better, saving their teeth, bone, gum. Yeah, they focus on the dollar and stop caring about health. Not sure if they would be this would be too hard. No, by the way, this is not hard to discuss. I have a lot. I just did a presentation for a group called Orthopreneurs. I did the Orthodontist Summit, and I've worked with dental practices. The thing is the customer's not thinking about the price. They're also not thinking about the long-term ramifications. Part of our job, not part of our job, it is our job, to say this is what's going to happen if you don't do this. Our job is to fast forward the film for them. And when I worked with one dental company in particular, that the actual, I forgot the name that I guess different offices use different names. There's the actual doctor, and we'll call that the assistant that's actually in there talking and actually doing the real work before the dentist comes in, right? The phrase will come to me later. But that person has to position all this information. In other words, have you thought about this? Well, here's what's going to happen down the road if this doesn't happen. And I know that sometimes they'll go, yeah. I said, no. You can't, yeah. What you have to do is kind of bring them back to center. I said, it isn't important now, but here's what it means to you. And there's got to be a way for you to have that conversation with confidence. When the dentist finally comes in, the orthodontist, they're going to confirm everything you've said. So what I say in a dental practice is, you as the, I don't know what the word is, the assistant, I know that's not the right word. You as the person dealing with the client, the patient, have to position yourself as a subject matter expert. The orthodontist, the dentist comes in and basically has to confirm everything you said. And one of the arguments I make is that you should be the hero, not the orthodontist. You should be on the patient side saying, here's what you need to do, here's why, let's find a way to make this happen. When we're looking at braces, for example, same thing. Here's what it means to you. Here's what it means to your confidence. Here's what it means to your career, your job opportunity. When you don't have this right, it changes your confidence, who you are, whatever it may be. Let them know the real cost. So I'm sorry that's a short answer, but for this conversation, but you get the idea. But it's how do you ask the right questions? For example, if it's a teeth issue, obviously it's a teeth issue, but if it's something like for braces, I said, here's what's going to happen down the road if you don't do this. You start fast forwarding the film, right? And then you start talking about also, think about the psychological impact, because there's usually 3 impacts, right? There's a physical impact, right? There's a psychological impact, and there's a financial impact, right? Physical, financial, psychological. Physical, financial, psychological. I would try to hit those 3. I call that the Trinity as well, right? If I can hit those three, tell you how physically this is going to impact you this way. You're not going to be able to eat. You're not going to be able to do this if you don't fix this right now. Psychologically, confidence is going to be low. Financially, today or tomorrow, you're going to have to pay for it. Down the road, as prices continue to go up, guess what? You're going to wind up paying more. Mr. Customer, you want to do this now. This is how important it is. And I think a big part of selling today, Soli, is that customers lack the confidence to make a buying decision. They lack the confidence. Our job is to give them the confidence. That's really what our job is today, to give them the confidence to make that decision. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. All right, Sodio, I'll leave it at that. Great presentation, Victor. How will you handle when you have a couple who, one of them sees the value of the service and the other doesn't see the value after going through the positioning, value, or price? We're in the, is it dentistry or dentistry field, and we have a lot of couples that come together for consults. It might be, go back to what I just asked with dealt with solely on, if it's the dentistry. Again, if you're seeing, if one person is not seeing the value, something's wrong. So maybe what you need to do is, as you're having these conversations, I always like to ask these, positive, affirming questions. Does that make sense? Don't overuse that one, by the way. It says, can you now see how that would cost you more? And I go, yeah, I can kind of see that. And when somebody says, I can kind of see that, that to me is a signal that they can't see it. So if you say, Victor, I can kind of see it, I said, I'll say it like this. I said, well, you said kind of see it. What don't you see? What doesn't make sense to you? So notice that I listen for signals. So when I hear what I call them ventilating modifiers. These are very soft words. Well, that could happen. That may happen. I can kind of see the value. When I hear stuff like that, my brain just alarms, like they're not buying it. So maybe that's where we're missing some of the deals there. When we hear those signals, some people just keep going. If you said, I kind of get it, oh, good. And then they keep going. I'm not going to say good. I'm going to go, well, what don't you kind of get? And by the way, find a polite way of saying it. But I said, okay, well, let me walk through it. Apparently something's not connecting. Can I ask you what that is? You're not seeing the value of doing this now. Can I ask why? See, part of the sales process today is being a little bold, not being rude, being a little bold and asking those questions. Because and I know, Custodio, that once they leave, they're not going to buy, right? The chance of you closing them is not going to happen. So why not be bold and ask the tough questions politely? Ask the tough questions there and then. Too often we just want to go through the presentation and we don't want to ask the tough questions. I know if you walk out of that door, I'm going to lose a deal. So if I know that, I'm going to ask you the hard questions. I say, well, what don't you see? So you don't think, are you of the opinion that the prices are not going to go up in the future? No, I didn't say that, Victor. So can we agree that the prices are going to go up? If the prices are going to go up, then we can also agree that if you don't do this today or tomorrow, this is going to happen. Yeah, I can see that, Victor. So we both agree that this needs to be done. The only issue here is probably finance. Is that it? See, I'm not afraid of talking money. Is that it? He goes, yeah, Victor, this is the cost. Okay, so if we can work out a plan, that's customized just for you, we can put that aside. Aside from the pricing, is there any other reason we shouldn't do this? No. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to figure this out together and figure out what type of structure payments we can do, because this is important. Again, see what I'm doing? I'm letting you know. I want you to have the confidence, but I also have the confidence to talk about numbers. Be bold. Be bold. What are they not thinking of? We have a better idea now. Okay, great, Soli. Andrew says, yes, good thought on what they aren't considering. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's it. They're not thinking about certain things. And we're not taught that in training or sales training a lot, is to really get people to think about the things they're not thinking about. We had a gentleman, I've told this story several times, but it's a great story. We had a guy who had the personality of a rock, zero personality, wanted to sell us a roof. And he came over, and my wife, who's very methodical, asked a lot of tough questions, and he was just like knocking him down. But not only knocking down the questions, like answering them, he was also like disagreeing with us. He says, no, you don't want to do that. Here's why. I love that. He said, here's why. And I'm like, well, why? And so he would explain. You're like, okay. And then he'd say things like this. No, if you're going to spend the money, don't spend it on that. what you want to do is put your money here because that's where you're going to save more money. So if you have to make a choice, and we're like, oh, I didn't know that. We never even thought of that. And what is the person doing? When they're making us think, they're positioning themselves as a subject matter expert, okay? So I want to close this out because I had a couple of more things I wanted to show you. I was gonna maybe not show you this, but I think based on these conversations I will. Let me just show you, these are only 2 more slides that I'm out of here, right? These are transitional slides. You know, when I want to shift the conversation, I use things like but, however, that said, yet, and I shift the conversation with social proof. Let me show you what I mean. And this may help you with a couple of situations you guys have. For example, look, Mr. Customer, our initial price is high, but remember, when you say but, that cancels this out, right? But in the long run, we're actually much cheaper than our competition. Here's what I mean. That's the social proof. Now you show them something. So again, it's always the statement, here's the objection, right? Here's the objection. Here's the transition phrase. Then whatever the phrase is going to be, but then here's where you offer some social proof. Let me give you a few more examples. How about this? Others say we're more expensive. Notice I raised the objection myself because I like blocking objections. Check out the Sales Velocity Academy course. Yet, it's almost like I didn't negate this. I go, but yet, we end up saving more later. Let me walk you through the numbers. Again, that's a transition phrase. Let's say, yeah, we're more expensive, yet in the long run, it will save you more money. How about this one right here? We are more expensive. However, over a 3-year period, we actually are more cost effective. Here's what I mean. And then you show them. Last one, and we'll close this out, is, our package is expensive. That said, it doesn't include other services like data. Let me show you why it'll be worth your time. Now notice, what I'm doing with those statements is I'm essentially taking control of the conversation. Now, in selling, what we want to do when we sell somebody, we want to increase their certainty and reduce the anxiety. Increase their certainty that they're making the right decision and reduce the anxiety, because they're thinking about, what about this? What about this? Our job is to reduce their anxiety, right? This is what we're selling. When we're selling, increase certainty, this is the right decision, reduce the anxiety that it's the wrong decision. Now, one more. If you have somebody at the beginning who's stubborn, we all have those, right? Customer who's stubborn, then you have to actually do a pre-sell. When you're pre-selling somebody, here's what I mean. It's a very interesting concept. This is when you first meet a customer and they're very sure of themselves, we almost have to do the opposite. We have to decrease their certainty. In other words, we have to destabilize their know-it-all attitude, right? We have to destabilize their certainty, and then we have to increase their anxiety. Again, notice we're doing the opposite. When somebody is stubborn, in other words, we all have customers who know it all, right? You ever have that person that know it all? Then the first thing we have to do is use questions to destabilize them. In other words, destabilize their certainty. Like, again, let's go back to the pricing information, right? Or the sales velocity question. Victor, you're too expensive. Well, so let me ask you a question. What about this? What about this? What about this, right? And what was I doing? I was destabilizing their certainty because they were certain I was too expensive. So I destabilized their certainty by asking them questions that had them arrive at a conclusion that maybe they weren't right. What did I do on the anxiety piece? I increased their anxiety by saying, look how much you're losing. So one is I decreased their certainty about 20,000 is too much. But I increased their anxiety at the same time by saying, look how much you're losing. See how that works? Because once a person feels uncertain, once a person has anxiety, then they're ready to be sold. In other words, they're ready to listen to what you have to offer. Let me know if that makes sense. I just created that concept because I was thinking about it. It's like first we have to destabilize them, make them give them more anxiety, and then they'll be ready to listen to what we have to offer. So for solely for the dental practice, they're certain that they don't need it. Your job is to destabilize that certainty, right? Through a series of questions, and you show them things. And then you increase their anxiety by basically saying, let me explain what happens when you don't do this. Let me tell you about potential costs and what's going to cost you. It's not just the money, it's going to be the time. For example, if you don't do braces, in the long run, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have to repair this, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have to do this. That's just the cost. That will require you to come in once a month, twice a month for a whole year. So it's not just time. I mean, not just money, it's also time combined. That's why you want to do it now. So again, what I'm doing is, first of all, I decrease their certainty that they're sure they don't need to do this by saying you need to do it. Then I increase the anxiety by saying, here's the full impact. In the case of the sales number, $1.7 million is what you're losing. Hopefully you get that. Anything else? Wow. Jay says, making stubborn people question themselves. This one's new to me. Yeah, this is what you're doing. So again, you're destabilizing them. And again, if I get you to almost second guess yourself, like you thought you knew it all, but if I get you to second guess yourself, or maybe you didn't really work through the numbers that I did, then all of a sudden I might be open to listening to you. So I'll close out with this, that in the example I gave you, when people call me and ask me about, how much do you cost, Victor? $20,000, that's too expensive, more than I expected to pay. My job is to destabilize them. I know I'm repeating myself, but I want you to get it. I destabilize them by asking them questions first, so I can get the data. When I do that gap analysis of where they are versus where they want to be, that's when they start thinking, oh, I didn't look at it that way. Now I'm not so certain. And then when I show them the full impact, the analysis, and then the results, here's what it's really costing you, then they're like, oh, maybe we need to do something like this or look at this. So again, think of that in those two ways. Destabilize them first, make them uncertain, increase their anxiety through your presentation. And it isn't about scaring them. So I want to be clear here. It's not about scaring people. It's about almost like pulling back the curtain and say, you're not thinking about this right here. Think about the UPS. They're focused on saving $60, but they're not understanding that it's going to cost them a lot more if they don't do that. In the case of the post office, if you switch, Victor, here's what it's going to cost you, and you're not thinking about that. Here is the hiss. And that is how you position value over price. If you can highlight the hiss, price moves into the background. If you can highlight the hiss, price fades. And that's how you position value over price. On that note, this is Victor Antonio, always reminding you, something ain't hard when you know how. Again, this will be in the Sales Velocity Academy, along with the presentation for you to download. Thank you for joining me, and look forward to next month's presentation. Take care, guys. See you.